My name is Stephane Wyper. I am the SVP of New Commerce Partnerships and Commercialization at Mastercard. That is probably the longest title at Mastercard. I've been with the company for 8 years. Most of the time I've spent there has been in one of two roles. One was on the innovation side, so I actually ran, ran everything we did from a startup perspective, so built and ran all of our startup efforts. And then in the last 3 years, I've been given the mandate to essentially look at the world of IoT, not through an experimentation lens, but really through a lens, and I'm hoping my presentation will be open and close, okay? I can multitask. Really looking at IoT through a lens of where we think there's an ability to develop commercially available solutions that can be deployed. So, boom, love it. I love when technology works. It's one of those challenges that it's only good if you can actually use it. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about retail. It's an area that I am both professionally and personally quite passionate about. I am Scottish, so this is Scottish excitement. So you'll have to appreciate this is me being very excited. We're going to start with a little bit of a story. This is Woodstock. This is 1969. I usually ask if anybody in the room has been to Woodstock. I almost never get a response, unless there's somebody wearing tie-dye in the back. Woodstock is remembered for one of two things. One, iconic music performances by the likes of Hendrix, The Who, Bob Dylan. The other element, though, is the fact that you had 400,000 people choose to spend a couple of days in a field in upstate New York, probably not showering very often, and remembering the experience. This wasn't just about the music, it was about the experience that they shared with others. Today, we live in a world where music has been fundamentally changed through the advent of digital. I'm guessing that probably most people in the audience today, the way in which you interact, access music, isn't done necessarily in a physical world environment. It's done through a digital environment, either through a streaming service or any of the other providers. So really thinking about digitization of music content. That being said, you'd assume that Woodstock was iconic, is easy to replicate that. Well, today, you've got 32 million people in the US that go to at least one music festival per year. So even in a world where you get digitization happening, where you're seeing transformation with all these new technologies being embedded, consumers becoming much more sophisticated, the music festival, the experience, still matters and is growing. And in many ways, digital really becomes complementary to that experience. It's the idea that instead of having a separate digital and physical experience, the two should weave together. So that when I'm going to a festival, I'm using digital as a mechanism to share that experience with others through whatever social platform I want to use. So I always start with that, really to talk about an experience that actually is very, very closely tied to what we see happening in the retail space. I'm guessing probably most of you are here with a mandate from your organizations to think about the pace of technology change, specifically in the IoT sector. I always believe it's really important to sort of step back and take some context. There's an overwhelming number of new technologies that you'll probably see, and trying to get a sense of how does that compare to what we've seen before. So there's a statistic which is roughly about 50 million consumers. That's sort of a baseline. It's not the Mark Zuckerberg billion consumers that matter, but 50 million is a good number in terms of when we start seeing traction from a technology perspective. This is the rotary telephone. It's invented by a Scotsman, by the way, just to plug that one. If you're thinking about 50 million consumers, how many years do you think we roughly got there? And I want to volunteer a guess. Otherwise, it's fine. 40. Good, 50. 75, so pretty close. 75 years to get from 0 to 50 million. Second part, Facebook, social platforms. This idea, this is a relatively new technology, relative in the sense that it's about 10 years or a decade old. The assumption here is this was rolled out within a sort of controlled way. So to get to 50 million, you're assuming it's actually in the 3.5 number of years. So you're seeing a rapid change in terms of the speed of adoption when you have digital being deployed as a technology channel for consumers. If anybody is familiar with Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go was an augmented reality experience that Nintendo launched in 2016. If anyone was walking around either San Francisco or New York in the summer of 2016 and saw people with their phones doing strange things, it wasn't the world's silent protest. This was actually people playing Nintendo's Pokemon Go. So to give you a real value in terms of how quickly this can be adopted, 19 days to get to 50 million consumers. 19 days. So what does it prove? It proves a couple things. One, consumers are actively using technology. Enterprises, be it brands, retailers, banks, are thinking about how they can leverage those technologies to reach those consumers. Secondly, experience really, really matters. If you find an experience that connects with that consumer, the adoption curve that we're seeing is much more rapid than anything we've seen before. So where do you start? One of the areas that we spend a lot of time is physical store environments. A couple of statistics which I always point to. 91% of the total dollar value of retail sales today still come from brick and mortar purchases. Secondly, you're seeing about $94 billion in anticipated investment in retail technology by 2022. There are real dollars being made or investment being made by key retailers, by brands, by the technology partners to service this industry. But brick and mortar, that experience is still key. A couple points which are worth looking at in terms of validating why that matters. One is the advent of what we call digitally native retailers. So folks like Casper, Warby Parker, Untuckit, I could go on, Bonobos. You've got companies that essentially said, we're going to go try and transform the retail experience within certain categories and try and compete with traditional players and build fairly unique and innovative business models, but also technology solutions and digital experiences that were unique. But what they realized very quickly was it's one thing having a digital engagement. It's an entirely different element when you think about how do I reach that consumer that still wants to have an emotional connection with the product I provide and do that in a real-world environment. That's exactly what you're seeing happen. All of the different brands I mentioned are investing in building out physical store environments. This is the example of a Casper store. So if you're not familiar with Casper, Casper is a company that essentially looked at the bedding or mattress industry, very exciting industry, and essentially said, let's go try and disrupt that. The way they did it was essentially say, we're going to make it purchasable entirely online, send you a mattress that literally comes in a box, open up, and it's available. But then they figured out fundamentally that there is an element around how we choose the things we sleep on, which is I actually have to touch and feel. Hence why they're investing in building out this. So it's not, again, not about a difference between having a digital or physical. It's about having a unified experience for that consumer. Second example I always give is a small startup called Amazon. I think most people may have heard of them. So Amazon, obviously a couple decades ago, decided to look at one particular category of retail, which was book sales, and say, we think there's a better way for that experience to work and do it in an online environment. I don't have any particular statistics, but I think they did okay. I'm not quite sure. I think that model seemed to work out quite well. But again, Amazon essentially pioneered this idea of thinking, let's take a category and really reinvent it and then expand from there. But what Amazon is doing, I call it reverse innovation, which is they're actually opening physical bookstores. So if anyone, I live in California, if anybody goes to most major cities, at least are starting to see these appear, they're building out physical brick and mortar, which is the thing they originally were trying to solve. The difference being is where they're leveraging the insights and the technology that they benefit from to change the experience when you walk into this bookstore. The model is different. This is not an infinite number of books that are available. It is a hyper-curated set of merchandise, set of book selections that are specifically using the insights that Amazon has on consumer preferences for specific books from within that zip code. So they're personalizing the actual books that are in that store based on the demand, the preferences that they believe the consumers that live in that environment will have. Again, bringing the best of both the online and physical together in a pretty unique way, with technology being a fundamental pillar of delivering that experience. The other element, and I think the last speaker started touching on where we see new opportunities or new verticals which are becoming connected. So I look at the world of retail as being, there's a reinvention that we see happening with investment being made in the existing sort of core element of the physical store environment. But equally, in a world where you're seeing consumers become ever increasing, the number of connected devices is growing. The statistics that we see in terms of how high that growth are also tend to vary depending on which research firm you are. I always just use the term a lot. There's going to be a lot of devices. From a retail perspective, and even from a bank perspective, that then begs a question, which is how do I extend my reach into that connected touchpoint? This is a distribution channel. It's a distribution play for a bank, for a retailer. They're thinking about if I'm interacting through whatever that device is, I'm thinking about how do I extend services into that location. One of those areas is the vehicle. So we spend a lot of time speaking to car manufacturers, and there's been a decent amount of interest in the last couple of years around thinking about cars and vehicles as a way for retail, or banking to become available, a distribution channel for them. There's a few things which I think are important to note when you think about the connected car. One is the number 45. 45 is the average number of minutes that we spend in our vehicles per day within the US. If you live in any other city beyond where I live in LA, that's usually your commute to work or wherever you're dropping your kids off. In my case, it's about 2 miles, in slightly longer. But the idea is I don't need to figure out everything I need to solve for that driver in that vehicle. I've just got to focus on that 45 minutes. What are the things that are going to be critical for me to bring to that consumer that they can't wait to do until they get to their destination? That's not many things. It's really 3 or 4 things. It's parking, it's fuel, it's food, it's convenience. Those are the 4 things. So really having a very specific focus on what you're solving for and what you need to solve for is absolutely key, especially when you look at the vehicle environment. This is not a provide everything to anyone. This is about focus and prioritization. The second part is a small thing called regulation, which I've heard is quite important, I think. So there's driver distraction laws that are being put in place in the US. In the state of California, the driver distraction laws are about 2 seconds, which basically means that when I'm in a vehicle and I'm looking and I'm driving, I can't be distracted from looking where I'm going for more than 2 seconds. I think even without regulation, it's probably a good idea to look where you're going. But that therefore means I'm not going to be able to get to a point where I have to touch, engage, interact. How else am I going to have that experience? Voice becomes the mechanism. So that's where we're spending a lot of time thinking about voice as the mechanism that consumers are going to be interacting within those vehicle environments because of the fact that you have driver distraction laws that are coming in, which mandate that you have to minimize the number of steps that a consumer has to go through. And that's where we think there's some really interesting opportunities to think about, A, how do I work with a variety of different retail partners to take a very complex, let's take a fast food menu, and make that very intuitive, very simple to use through a voice interaction. Second part, bless you, second part is also the authentication piece. So the ability to make sure that when someone's completing a transaction, completing a purchase, we can leverage biometric authentication using voice as a way to confirm who that consumer is. So again, vehicle is one of those examples where we're seeing retail becoming extended, but it's all about focus, prioritization, and balancing really good experience, but also maintaining security. So I often talk about things that we've seen happen before and how those are being redesigned today. I'm going to touch on 2. The first is this idea of solving for friction, the idea of how do I take elements which are troublesome or difficult from a consumer perspective and take that out of the equation. This is an airport. I'm assuming most of you may have been to an airport at some point in the last month. This looks a little bit different. This is from the 1970s or so. It's more or less the same with the exception of there's probably more mustaches, I think, and also a lot more people. This was the fundamental challenges that airlines had initially, which was before the consumer even engages with me, even starts their journey, even checks in with me, even gets their ticket, this is what they're faced with. That's friction. So that then begged the question, how does technology go solve for that first experience when somebody walks into the airport and instead of having to be inundated with this and wait in lines, how do I remove that point of friction? That's where you started seeing the adoption of this. So this was probably in the 90s, you start seeing the first rollout of these essentially self-check-in components. This is now widespread across every airport. If you look at, in general, most consumers are using a digital ticket form factor or checking in through this versus going to an actual individual and getting a printed ticket or doing it online. So that's solved for a very fundamental part, which is that friction in order to engage with that airline. So I want to start the experience and make it very seamless, very easy for me to get my ticket in order to get onto my plane. It hasn't stopped there, though. You look at the advent then saying, well, let's follow that consumer journey up to the point they get on the plane. Before you had a point where, well, I'm going to get some food or drinks before I go to the gate, there was friction that existed there. The friction around having to figure out how I pay, how do I find the server, how do I know what's available. Again, you're seeing deployments of smart tablets like this across a number of different airports, all focus on providing much easier ways for consumers to not only select the products they want, pay for what they want, but get real-time information on their flights. It's solving for friction through the entire journey with the airline. So one of the things we've spent time doing at Mastercard is focusing on reimagining what we call the point of acceptance or point of interaction. So the examples you'll see behind are some things we've been deploying with actual retail partners. Essentially saying, when I'm a retailer, I should think about how do I change the point of sale so it's not necessarily the thing that sits at the front of my store, but can be contextual, can be designed for the environment, for the experience, for the consumer I'm trying to target. So we've been able to not only allow consumers to shop directly from storefront windows, as you see there, so the ability for me to walk past, and as a retailer, I don't even need to have my store open, but consumers can still interact, engage, look at product that's sitting in that storefront, and then purchase there and then through that type of smart window capability. Equally so, we've been doing the same around smart mirror technology. Again, something that's very interesting as you think about certain types of fashion spaces, the ability to solve friction when you go into those type of fitting room environments and make it so I can check out and choose how I want to purchase or get my goods directly from the fitting room so I'm not leaving, having to stand in line, and then go purchase. It should be very seamless for me. The other interesting point just on the fitting room component, we actually used RFID technology, very low cost, 2 to 3 cents, and what it allowed the retailers to start understanding is data on which products were being brought into the fitting room and then how that correlates with what was actually being purchased. If anyone goes to a fitting room today, you'll see a pile of clothes. I always get a little bit frustrated when I see that because that's insight, that's data that a retailer's not able to see. And again, through a world of connectivity, you can essentially now make that insight available to the retailer. So that's one thing we've thought about is changing the point of interaction to essentially be any surface, any device that gets deployed in a retail environment, we can essentially make connected and we can make it flexible from a payment perspective, but also how the consumer wants to receive their goods. Second thing is the idea of kind of bringing the store directly to the consumer. So this idea, again, we've talked a lot about physical store being reinvented and how you see technology being embedded within that. But there's also this view, which is consumers are still going to shop in a digital environment as well. So how do I essentially recreate that type of experience? How do I make it better for consumers to engage with me in a digital environment? So you're probably thinking, the concept of retail outside of store is probably where our good friends at Amazon sort of helped develop that. This is probably the best example. I had a lot of fun pulling this together. This is the Sears robot catalog from 1875. I actually bought this on Amazon. It's worth the read. It's fascinating. But Sears, it's almost the same. Well, it's well over 100 years now. But this was the same business principle. It was the idea they have a flagship store that consumers not in the US weren't always able to get to. So how do I make it possible for you as a consumer to access the products that I have in that store in any environment or in any location you have? There's always a couple of examples. So a pretty eclectic mix, I can say. Everything from some wonderful electric belts, which I'm sure all of you want, all the way to some wonderful plush capes, which is perfect for the 70-degree weather we have today, all the way through to a vehicle at the low, low price of $395. So again, diversity in terms of product selection, being able to provide to consumers that can't come to that physical environment a full set of choice, a full set of options. Not a new concept, but technology has fundamentally changed that model. Let me give you an example of one of the brand partners that we've been able to work with. It's a brand called Fred Siegel. Fred Siegel is based in Southern California, but they do have presence in a few other locations globally, as well as in the US. They had a challenge, which was, we obviously have a flagship store that we've invested heavily. Our online environment is fairly limited. We call it more transactional in nature, as you see, so it looks fairly similar to what you see with any other e-commerce, kind of a list view. And they said, how can we help reinvent our online environment by leveraging the capabilities that we've brought and the investment we made in our physical store? How do we connect the two? So that's where we actually launched a technology last month called Immersive Commerce. Essentially what we're doing is using 360 video capture, so deploying cameras inside of a physical store. This is the flagship store at Fred Segal. And essentially recreating that through an online environment. So if you go to fredsegal.com, this is the experience you can go through and actually purchase. So from a retailer perspective, again, it's linking physical store into online. It brings the experiential, intuitive element when you walk around the store to life, leveraging a digital channel. It has the ability to bring in media content, social content, has the ability to pull in product information. So again, this idea of there is a reinvention that can happen, not only around physical store, but equally when you look at the online experience. And again, leveraging technology is a fundamental way to achieve that vision. Thank you.